You are lying in the cool shadows of the Nile, listening to the faint rustle of reeds against the water. Imagine waking in the household of a nobleman in ancient Sudan, long before the sun has risen fully over the horizon. It is the kingdom of Cush, perhaps around the first centuries before Christ, a kingdom often overshadowed in the history books by its larger neighbor, Egypt. Yet here, daily life took on a rhythm of its own, steady, quiet, and marked by details so ordinary that most chroniclers passed over them without comment. But those details are the fabric of survival itself, and they shaped how nobles and their households began each day. The first thing you notice is the silence before the city stirs. Nobles in Meroe, the capital of Cush, lived in large compounds with walls of mud brick, sometimes decorated with painted plaster. Before the first meal could even be considered, servants rose in the darkness to prepare the household. They swept the courtyards, poured water into jars from heavy clay pots, and checked the embers from the previous night's fire. It was rare to build a new flame from nothing if yesterday's embers could be coaxed back into life. The noble family itself did not rise until the early light of the sun reflected on the river. And when they did, the morning did not begin with food at all, but with washing. In the arid climate, cleanliness was more than ritual, it was survival. Basins of water were poured over the hands and faces of the masters of the house, while oils and perfumes were rubbed lightly into the skin to keep it from cracking in the heat. These small rituals were markers of status. The more perfumed oils you owned, the more wealthy you were perceived to be. To a noble in Cush, smelling faintly of imported myrrh or frankincense at the morning meal was as much a symbol of prestige as the gold jewelry they wore. Breakfast itself began slowly because food was not immediately available. Grains had to be ground fresh each morning. This was the task of the women and young servants, who bent over stone querns to pound sorghum or mill it into fine meal. The sound of grinding was one of the most common morning sounds across the kingdom, a rhythmic scraping that echoed through courtyards. Archaeologists still find these grinding stones scattered across Sudan today, worn smooth by centuries of use. But why sorghum? Sorghum and millet thrived in the heat where wheat could not, and so they became the backbone of every household diet, noble or common. For nobles, however, these grains were prepared differently. Instead of being boiled into simple porridge as peasants might eat, the grain was often mixed with honey, milk, or sesame oil, ingredients that required wealth trade or land ownership. Milk came from cattle, a marker of prosperity. In Nubian and Sudanese culture, cattle were not only wealth but sacred companions. To own a herd meant to command both resources and respect. At the nobles' table, the morning porridge was enriched with milk or sometimes clarified butter, giving it a richness that ordinary families could not afford daily. Honey, too, was rare. Kept in clay jars, it crystallized easily, but it was treasured both as food and medicine. A spoonful stirred into hot porridge transformed a plain dish into a luxury. For nobles, honey was a status symbol, something one could offer to guests with quiet pride. It was sweet, thick, and a taste that reminded them of fertility, abundance, and the generosity of the gods. The table itself was not a table as we imagine today. Nobles sat on mats woven from reeds, and bowls were set on low stands of wood or clay. Meals were communal, but hierarchy was clear. The head of the household ate first, followed by his wives, children, and then the extended servants. Eating was not rushed. The cool of the morning was a time to prepare mentally for the obligations of the day, whether it was receiving petitions from farmers, organizing a caravan, or sending messages to neighboring chiefs. Alongside porridge, flatbreads were also common, baked fresh on clay griddles. The dough was made quickly from ground grain, mixed with water and a pinch of salt. But nobles often had the luxury of adding sesame seeds into the dough, lending a nutty taste and aroma. These breads were small, round, and eaten warm, tore apart by hand. Bread was dipped into milk or honey, or used to scoop up porridge in small portions. Even something as ordinary as bread reflected class distinctions. The more additives and flavorings, the higher the status. Dates were another frequent part of noble breakfasts. Sudanese dates grew in abundance along the Nile, and while commoners ate them often, nobles consumed them differently. Instead of simply chewing on dried dates, nobles might mash them into paste, spread them over bread, or soak them in water to create a mildly sweet drink. Dates provided quick energy, but they also carried symbolic value. To offer dates to guests in the morning was to extend peace, hospitality, and goodwill. We should not imagine breakfast as a silent affair. There was talking, planning, and soft negotiations that began even before official work. Nobles lived in a world of constant decision-making. Which messenger should be sent to the Egyptian traders arriving next week? How many jars of beer should be allocated to the workers at the iron-smelting furnaces? The breakfast mat became a place where family and politics mixed, with food in hand and thoughts already turning toward trade routes, cattle counts, and obligations to the temple. Beer deserves its own mention, even at breakfast. Though stronger allies were reserved for feasts, light beer, brewed from millet, was common in the mornings. It was weak in alcohol but rich in nutrients, almost like a liquid bread. For nobles, beer was not only sustenance but ritual. Some poured small offerings on the ground before drinking, a gesture of respect to ancestors or local gods. To begin the day without acknowledging these unseen forces was unthinkable. For even in the smallest habits, religion was woven into life. The nobles' children experienced breakfast differently. While the master of the household might enjoy a richly flavored porridge, children were often given watered-down versions. It was not indulgence but discipline, to teach moderation, to avoid waste. They learned to chew slowly, to eat in silence when commanded, to wait their turn. These small lessons mirrored the larger hierarchies of society: patience, respect, and submission to order. And then there were the servants. Their meals were plain but necessary: leftover porridge, broken bread, sometimes just gruel. But servants were also the invisible laborers that made noble luxury possible. Their grinding, their tending of cattle, their fetching of water, these tasks were the foundation of every noble breakfast. Without their work, no bowl of honey grain would ever reach the master's hand. The final detail of the morning meal was often fruit, when the season allowed it. Pomegranates, imported through Egyptian traders, were rare but highly prized. To cut open a pomegranate at breakfast was to reveal 100 jewels inside, seeds glistening red in the sun. But more often, fruit meant figs grown locally, dried for storage, and eaten sparingly. Their sweetness ended the meal softly, with a lingering taste before the day's work began. What strikes you most about the noble breakfast is not extravagance, but ritual. Every detail carried meaning. Clean water, grinding grain, pouring beer, breaking bread. These were not simply acts of hunger, but affirmations of life, wealth, and order. Each morning repeated the rhythms of ancestors long before, and each bite reminded nobles of their place in a fragile chain of survival along the Nile. And yet, one question lingers, as the last bowls are cleared away. If the nobles began each day with such careful ritual, what happened when those rituals were broken? What did it mean when famine, flood, or political collapse interrupted the simple act of breakfast? Imagine, for a moment, that you are still seated on the woven reed mat, the last of the morning porridge cooling in the clay bowl before you. The air is warming now. As the sun climbs higher above the Nile and the sound of the city beyond the noble's compound grow louder, cattle lowing, donkeys braying, merchants shouting from the markets. Breakfast, though simple in its appearance, was not only about nourishment. In the noble households of ancient Sudan, each ingredient, each bowl, each bite was tied to something larger. Networks of trade that stretched across deserts, rituals of faith that demanded acknowledgement, and the ever-present question of status and control. Let us begin with trade, because nothing arrived at the noble breakfast mat without passing through many hands. The honey stirred into morning porridge, the dates pressed into paste, even the sesame seeds sprinkled onto bread. All of these were tied to movement, exchange, and labor. Honey was gathered from hives along the riverbanks, tended by specialists who knew the temperament of bees and the cycles of flowers. Dates grew in clustered groves, carefully cultivated and harvested at the right season. Sesame, however, was different. It was both a local crop and a traded one, carried along caravan routes that stretched south into Africa and north into Egypt. Trade gave nobles access to foods that ordinary people could rarely touch. Imagine a caravan winding slowly through the desert, camels burdened with baskets of spices, jars of oil, and blocks of salt. Salt, though not always thought of as a luxury today, was one of the most valuable commodities in ancient Sudan. To sprinkle a pinch of salt into morning porridge was to display access of power, because salt preserved food, flavored dishes, and sustained life in the heat. The nobles of Kush understood this deeply, and so they claimed control over salt mines and trade routes whenever possible. Breakfast, therefore, was not a private meal, but a public statement. To place sesame bread, honey, or salted porridge before guests was to announce one's connections to the great arteries of commerce. The more diverse the foods, the farther the nobles' influence stretched. And this mattered, because the kingdom of Kush thrived not only on agriculture, but on a strategic position between Africa and Egypt, between the desert and the river. Now consider religion, which infused even the smallest act of eating. Before a noble lifted a bowl to his lips, there might be a gesture of offering, a few drops of milk poured on the ground, or a small piece of bread placed aside for the gods or ancestors. The Kushites worshipped a wide pantheon, including their own gods and those borrowed from Egypt, Ammonius, Isis, and Osiris, among others. To eat without offering was unthinkable, especially for nobles who carried the responsibility of setting example. Temples, too, influenced breakfast. Many ingredients found at the nobles' table also appeared in ritual offerings. Honey was poured into jars of the gods, milk was offered at altars, and dates were laid before statues. The household breakfast was, in some ways, a shadow of the larger religious feasts, scaled down for daily life. To taste honey at home was to taste a fragment of what priests offered in the temples, connecting family to divinity in a simple but powerful way. There was also the matter of political symbolism. Nobles did not eat alone in their compounds. Guests, petitioners, and allies might share the morning meal, and the choice of what was served could carry weight. A guest offered only porridge might feel slighted, while one given bread with sesame oil and dates understood that he was respected. To share food was to share status, and in the world of Kush, alliances were strengthened not only in councils and temples, but around the breakfast mat. Let us pause on the subject of beer, that light, nourishing brew made from millet. At first glance, it seems a humble drink, but for the nobles of Kush, it was a tool of diplomacy. To offer beer in the morning was to extend trust, to show that the host valued his guests enough to share a staple of the household. Beer was cheap to make but time-consuming, and so the very act of brewing it at scale required resources, land, and labor. To have it consistently available was considered, too, the servants who prepared the meal. Their role was invisible but vital, and nobles understood that their own status was reflected in the smooth running of the household. If the grain was ground unevenly, if the bread was burnt, if the beer was sour, it reflected poorly on the master. Servants worked under immense pressure, their daily labor woven into the politics of reputation. A single mistake in breakfast could ripple outward, becoming a whisper of incompetence among rival nobles. Food also linked directly to health and longevity. Nobles believed that certain foods carried protective powers. Milk strengthened the body. Honey preserved youth. Sesame oil kept the skin supple in the heat. To begin the day with these foods was not only indulgence, but a form of daily medicine. The noble's breakfast, then, was as much about preserving life as it was about displaying wealth. We might imagine that such routines were stable and unchanging, but history reminds us that trade routes shifted, famine struck, and floods disrupted agriculture. What then happened to the noble breakfast when the Nile failed to flood, or when caravans were raided, or when enemies cut off supplies? The rituals of the morning meal were fragile, dependent on a delicate balance of environment, economy, and power. And this brings us back to the deeper truth. Breakfast was not just the first meal of the day. It was a reflection of the entire structure of society. Each spoonful of porridge carried within it the labor of servants, the wealth of herds, the reach of trade caravans, the blessings of gods, and the fragile prestige of noble households, itself a symbol of abundance. Yet one unresolved question lingers, even as the noble sets aside his empty bowl and prepares for the day's duties. When the kingdom itself faced decline, when Egypt pressed harder, when Rome loomed from afar, when deserts encroached on fertile land, did the nobles of Kush cling to their breakfast rituals as symbols of order, or did those rituals crumble along with the power they represented? The noble breakfast, with its bowls of sorghum porridge and its baskets of dates, might seem like a small detail in the vast stretch of history. Yet when we lean closer, when we listen to the grinding of grain in the early morning or smell the faint sweetness of honey stirred into hot milk, we see that these quiet meals were more than food. They were a mirror of power, a reflection of survival, and a fragile ritual that held together the rhythm of daily life. But like all rituals, they were vulnerable to time. To understand how, we must follow the arc of the kingdom of Kush itself. For centuries, it stood as one of the great civilizations of Africa, its kings ruling not only Sudan, but at times even Egypt itself. The city of Meroe became a center of iron production, trade, and cultural life. Nobles flourished here, building their homes along the Nile and living lives that seemed secure, anchored by their routines of breakfast and ceremony. But nothing in history is permanent. By the later centuries, the trade routes that once brought sesame oil, pomegranates, and fine goods began to shift. The rise of Rome disrupted the flow of commerce, while new powers along the Red Sea diverted caravans and merchants. The one steady stream of goods that gave noble breakfast their richness became uncertain. Where once the morning table held honey and imported fruits, scarcity began to creep in. Porcelain bowls of delicacies gave way to plain millet gruel. The very foods that symbolized prestige grew rare, and with their absence came a slow erosion of the rituals they had supported. At the same time, the environment pressed harder. The Nile's floods grew unpredictable, sometimes too high, sometimes too low. Without reliable harvests, even the most powerful nobles struggled to maintain abundance. A failed flood meant poor grain yields, thin cattle, and a breakfast stripped of richness. Suddenly, rituals that had once seemed eternal, pouring milk for the gods, dipping bread in honey, were harder to sustain. Even the smallest absences carried symbolic weight. To lose honey from the table was not only a change of flavor, but a quiet sign that power itself was slipping. Religion, too, transformed. The gods of Kush, once honored with milk and dates, began to lose their hold as Christianity spread across the region in later centuries. By the time new faiths entered the Nile Valley, the old offerings and rituals had begun to fade. A morning meal might still begin with bread and porridge, but the gestures of sacrifice to Monius or Isis dwindled. Breakfast became less a sacred act and more a practical one. In that transformation, an entire worldview dissolved silently into the flow of time. Yet in their quiet way, the habits of noble households left a trace. Archaeologists today uncover grinding stones worn smooth by centuries of use. They find jars once filled with honey, seeds of sesame pressed into forgotten corners, fragments of bread ovens, blackened by fire. These remains tell us that even the most ordinary meals carried weight, that breakfast itself was a marker of civilization. They remind us that power is not only written in monuments and battles, but in the quiet rhythm of daily bread. And here we confront a final question. Why does it matter what nobles ate for breakfast 2,000 years ago? The answer is simple and complex at once. Because breakfast was more than food, it was identity. It told a noble who they were, what power they held, and how far their influence stretched. It connected them to ancestors, to gods, to trade, and to the fragile cycles of the river. In the end, when kingdoms rise and fall, when pyramids crumble and dynasties vanish, what remains in memory are often the small, stubborn details. Think of it. A spoon of honey stirred into porridge, a child waiting for their turn to eat, a servant grinding grain in the cool shadows before sunrise. These acts, though ordinary, shaped the rhythm of an empire. And when the empire was gone, the habits echoed on in smaller ways, in villages, in households, in memories passed quietly through generations. The nobles themselves vanished. Their titles, their wealth, their temples, even their gods, all slipped into history's silence. But the porridge of sorghum, the bread baked on clay griddles, the taste of dates at dawn, these endured in new forms, in new places, in the ordinary meals of ordinary people. What was once a symbol of status became simply food for survival, and in that descent from luxury to necessity lies one of history's quiet truths. Power fades, but daily life persists. So the question lingers as you close your eyes and imagine the past. When we look at the remnants of our own age, thousands of years from now, will historians remember our wars and monuments, or will they wonder about our breakfasts, the small, forgotten rituals that began our days, and the ways they reflected who close your eyes and picture the grandeur of Rome? Marble temples glinting in the sun, senators in spotless togas, soldiers marching in polished armor. History often preserved the gleam, the clean lines, the sense of order. But behind that image lies an ordinary, almost forgotten truth. Those spotless white togas did not remain white by accident. They required constant care, constant washing, and a strange industry of laundries and soaps that stretched across the Roman world. This is a story of how laundry, so dull, so ordinary, shaped the rhythms of Roman life. In the Roman city, laundry was not done quietly at home. Instead, it was handled in public spaces called phalonici, commercial laundries at dotted neighborhoods. These were noisy, smelly places, filled with tubs, stones, and workers who spent their days treading on cloth with bare feet. To walk down a Roman street was to hear the rhythmic squelching of feet in basins, the slapping of wet cloth on stone, and the hissing of boiling cauldrons. Cleanliness was not only a matter of hygiene, it was a business, and one that touched every Roman, noble or poor. The first step of Roman laundry may shock the modern ear. Urine, collected from public urinals placed along the streets. Human urine was gathered in jars and carted to the laundries. Why urine? Because it contained ammonia, a natural cleaning agent that could strip grease, oil, and dirt from fabric. Workers, called full ones, poured urine into tubs we believe ourselves to be, mixed it with water, and placed dirty garments into the solution. Then, barefoot, they stepped into the tub and began to stomp. Back and forth, side to side, pressing fabric underfoot like grapes in a wine vat. The smell was pungent, unmistakable, and yet to the Romans it was the scent of cleanliness in progress. Once stomped and rinsed, the garments were rubbed with fuller's earth, a clay that absorbed grease and restored brightness. This was particularly important for the prized white togas of the elite. A toga was not just clothing. It was a symbol of citizenship, a marker of status. To appear in public with a stained toga was shameful. To appear in a brilliantly white one was honorable. Thus, the laundries became essential to public life. Senators, magistrates, and merchants alike relied on humble full ones to preserve the dignity of their appearance. Soap, as we know it today, was not the primary cleaning agent in early Rome. Instead, mixtures of animal fat and ashes were sometimes used in combination with urine and clay. These pastes, when rubbed into cloth, broke down dirt and oils. By the later empire, true soaps made from fats and lye became more common, particularly in provinces like Gaul, where soap making became a craft. But even then, urine remained central, a reminder of how resourceful and how pragmatic Roman society could be. Inside the Phallonica, the process was relentless. After stomping, rinsing, and rubbing with clay, garments were beaten on stone slabs, stretched, and hung out to dry in courtyards. Workers brushed wool with thistles to raise the nap, restoring its softness. They used sulfur fumes to bleach and freshen cloth, sealing garments in closed chambers where sulfur burned, releasing acrid smoke that clung to the fabric. To step into a Phallonica was to step into a world of heat, steam, odors, and ceaseless motion. The laundries were not hidden away. They were part of the city, and the smell carried through the streets. Yet they were accepted, even respected, because they were necessary. In Pompeii alone, archaeologists have found more than 24 Phalonici, evidence that nearly every neighborhood depended on them. Mosaics and frescoes even depicted laundry scenes, showing workers treading on cloth, a visual reminder of the industry's importance. But laundry was not only about cleanliness. It was about economy. The urine tax, imposed by Emperor Vespasian in the 1st century, turned waste into revenue. Collectors placed jars in public, and citizens contributed freely. The full ones purchased the urine, and part of their payments went to the state. It was said that when Vespasian's son Titus mocked the idea of profiting from such a foul substance, the emperor held a coin to his nose and asked if it smelled. "Money does not stink." He replied, "Pecunia non olet," a phrase that still survives today. Breakfast tables and senatorial debates may have shaped Rome's identity, but so did laundries. Behind every polished marble statue, behind every pristine toga, behind every officer's gleaming cloak, stood the uncelebrated labor of the full ones. Their work was menial, smelly, and endless, yet it kept the wheels of society turning. Without them, Rome's image of order and dignity would have quickly unraveled. So the question rises quietly in the steam-filled air of a Phallonica. If cleanliness was so essential to Rome's public image, what happened to that image when the laundries faltered, when cities fell, when trades collapsed, and when the long rhythms of soap and urine were broken? When we imagine Rome, we think of senators in polished togas, generals in crisp cloaks, matrons draped in spotless stoli. What we do not often imagine are the workers behind the fabric, the men and women who spent their lives in the steamy heat of laundries, stomping cloth in tubs of urine, scraping wool with thistles, or lifting heavy jars of water. The laundries, or phalanikai, were not merely a side industry of Rome. They were deeply woven into the economy, into social order, and into the ways Romans understood appearance and respectability. Let us begin with the workers themselves. The full ones. Their lives were hard, and their work was often despised. To labor day after day among foul-smelling vats was to mark oneself as part of lower class. Yet, paradoxically, their services were indispensable. No senator could appear in a forum without a bright white toga. No bride could present herself in a stained gown, and no priest could conduct sacrifice in soiled robes. The full ones lived in contradiction, mocked for their labor, yet needed by every class of society. Within the laundries, labor was divided. Some workers hauled water from wells or aqueduct spouts, filling basins that never stayed full for long. Others stomped garments in urine vats, their feet red and raw from constant contact. Skilled workers handled bleaching or finishing, brushing wool with care, or using sulfur fumes to whiten garments for the elite. Apprentices learned slowly, beginning with menial tasks before moving to more delicate operations. These divisions reflected Rome's obsession with hierarchy. Even in washing, there were levels of skill and prestige. Economically, laundries were not small affairs. Some were family-run, passed down through generations. Others were large businesses with dozens of workers, serving entire neighborhoods. In Pompeii, one of the largest phalanikai occupied a whole city block with multiple basins, drying areas, and workshops. Its size tells us something crucial. Cleanliness was not a luxury for a few, but shared demand across the city. From humble tunics to expensive togas, all clothing eventually found its way to the hands of the full ones. The gender roles in this industry were complex. Men dominated the ownership and operation of phalanikai, but women and children also worked within them. Women often helped with spinning, mending, or finishing garments after cleaning. Children carried buckets, fetched water, or tended fires. For poorer families, sending children to work in laundries was a way to secure income, even if it meant consigning them to a lifetime of labor among the stink of urine and sulfur. The laundries thus became places where the weight of survival pressed hardest on the vulnerable. Socially, laundries reflected Rome's obsession with appearance and class distinction. A poor man in a tunic might send his only garment to be washed, stretching his budget just to avoid the shame of filth. An elite senator, by contrast, might send an entire wardrobe, expect his clothes to be returned gleaming white and freshly brushed. The brighter the toga, the greater the impression in the forum. Appearance was politics, and laundries were the hidden machinery that sustained it. And here lies an irony worth pausing on. Rome's ideals of virtue and dignity were inseparable from the foul-smelling industry of fullers. To be respected in society was to look clean, and look clean required the unglamorous labor of those at the bottom of the hierarchy. Every gleaming toga in the Senate chamber whispered of the feet that had stomped it, of the hands that had rubbed it with clay, of the lungs that had inhaled sulfur fumes to bleach it white. The nobles' honor rested, quite literally, on the backs of the despised. Economically, laundries also linked to taxation and imperial control. The urine tax introduced by Vespasian was not merely a curiosity. It was a demonstration of Rome's ability to monetize anything, even waste. Citizens contributed urine, collectors gathered it, laundries purchased it, and the state profited. This chain transformed a daily necessity into a revenue stream. Money, as Vespasian said, did not stink. But for the full ones, the coins they earned were steeped in the odor of ammonia. The laundries were also tied to religious and cultural rituals. Garments used in sacrifices had to be pure, spotless, ritually clean. The full ones provided that service. The whitening of priestly robes, the careful finishing of ceremonial cloths, the removal of stains before festivals. These tasks gave the laundries a role in the sacred as well as the mundane. Even as society looked down on them, temples depended on their skill. Yet there was always tension. Romans associated foul smells with moral corruption, and the laundries reeked. Workers sometimes faced prejudice, jokes, and exclusion. Martial, the poet, mocked full ones in his verses, comparing their stench to shame. To be seen coming out of Phalanica was not glamorous, even if one's garments were freshly cleaned. The laundries lived in this paradox, despised and yet essential. We must also think of daily rhythm. For many Romans, life was measured not by hours but by tasks, by when the bread was baked, when the market opened, when the baths were filled. For the full ones, rhythm was set by water, by vats, by drying cloth in the sun. In the morning, garments were stomped and rinsed. By midday, sulfur chambers smoked. In the afternoon, clothes hung across courtyards, drying in the Mediterranean light. To walk through a city was to see lines of cloth stretched between buildings, bright spots of white fluttering above narrow streets. Laundry was not hidden. It was everywhere, a daily presence in urban life. And yet, beneath all of this industry, one question lingered. If the dignity of Rome depended on spotless garments, what happened when laundries could not keep up, when wars, shortages, or economic collapse disrupted the flow of clean clothing? Could the image of Rome survive if its togas were stained? If its citizens appeared in public with the marks of labor still clinging to their clothes? The laundries of Rome, with their steaming tubs and sulfur chambers, might seem like eternal features of the ancient city. For centuries, they kept the garments of senators bright, the tunics of soldiers clean, the robes of priests spotless. But like so many parts of Rome, they were not eternal. In time, the wash basins fell silent, the vats dried, and the full ones, the men and women whose stomping feet kept Rome's dignity intact, faded into history. What replaced them was not silence, but transformation. The decline began gradually, with the same forces that unraveled Rome itself. Trade routes faltered. The steady flow of salt, clay, and even urine collectors grew uncertain. Urban populations shrank, and with fewer citizens came fewer garments to wash, fewer coins to collect. Where once whole city blocks had been filled with laundries, now only a few remained. The fall of Pompeii in 79 CE froze one Thessalonica in time. Archaeologists have uncovered it, complete with basins, drying racks, and vats, offering a vivid glimpse into what daily life once looked like. But the frozen moment of Pompeii also reminds us that entire cities could vanish in an instant, and with them the industries that sustained them. The laundries were fragile, their existence tied to urban density, water supply, and the constant demand for pristine clothing. As Christianity spread across the empire, attitudes toward clothing also shifted. White garments still mattered in ritual, but emphasis on simplicity and modesty began to soften the obsession with gleaming whiteness. The toga itself fell out of common use, replaced by simpler tunics and cloaks. Without the toga's central role as a symbol of Roman identity, laundries lost some of their cultural importance. What had once been indispensable became merely practical. Soap, meanwhile, began to evolve. In the provinces of Gaul and Germany, soap making from animal fat and lye became more refined. By the later centuries, soap slowly replaced urine as the cleaner of choice, especially as the knowledge of chemistry advanced. Yet in Rome itself, the habits of the full ones lingered stubbornly, long after other parts of the empire began to change. Tradition clung to the vats and stomping feet, even as the world shifted around them. When Rome fell, the laundries fell too. Cities shrank, aqueducts crumbled, and trade routes dissolved. Without strong urban centers, there was no longer a place for large-scale laundries. Washing returned to the household, to riversides and courtyards, to the small-scale rhythms of families and villages. The grand system of public phalonicae, with its workers, taxes, and sulfur fumes, was gone. The silence of the basins was the silence of empire itself. And yet, the laundries did not disappear without leaving traces. The very idea of professional cleaners, people whose lives were devoted to caring for fabric, survived into the medieval period. In towns and monasteries, washerwomen and dyers carried on fragments of the work once done by full ones. The tax on urine may have faded, but the saying pecunia non olet, money does not stink, remained a linguistic ghost of Rome's oddest revenue stream. Even our modern obsession with bright whites and fresh-smelling clothes carries echoes of Rome's ancient laundries. Archaeologists today find evidence of this forgotten industry everywhere. The clay vats in Pompeii, the worn steps of laundries in Ostia, the graffiti left by workers who spent their lives among the fumes, all tell us that Rome's image of order depended not just on senators and soldiers, but on humble laborers who kept garments clean. The stones remember their footsteps, even if history books rarely do. And here lies the reflection that lingers. Why should we care about Roman laundries at all? The answer, perhaps, is that they remind us of the hidden foundations of civilization. Rome did not survive on marble and rhetoric alone. It survived because workers bent their backs over tubs, because children carried buckets of water, because ordinary people found ways to turn waste into utility. Without them, the glittering facade of empire would have stained and crumbled much sooner. So imagine, for a moment, the silence after the fall. The vats empty, the sulfur chambers dark, the smell of ammonia gone from the streets. The toga, once the pride of Rome, no longer needed whitening. The city shrank and the laundries vanished. What remained was a memory, faint but telling. That power and dignity rest not on monuments alone, but on the unnoticed, the unglamorous, the forgotten industries that keep life moving. And so the question lingers quietly, like the ghost of steam rising from a basin. When future generations look back on us, will they measure our greatness by our monuments, or will they search the traces of our laundries, the hidden labors that kept our world running, invisible until they were gone? The Nile was both Egypt's blessing and its burden. Year after year, its floods carried rich silt that renewed the fields, allowing farmers to grow grain in a desert where life should have been impossible. But sometimes the river gave too much. The floods rose higher than expected, swallowing fields, drowning villages, and leaving families stranded on islands of mud. For nobles, such disasters meant tax shortfalls and grain shortages. But for ordinary Egyptians, the farmers, the craftsmen, the servants, it meant an even more pressing question. What would they eat when the fields were underwater? In these years of excessive flooding, survival required creativity. The usual rhythms of plowing, sowing, and harvesting were broken. Fields lay submerged for weeks, sometimes months. Grain could not be planted, and stores from the previous year dwindled. Families turned to whatever could be eaten, while they waited for the waters to recede. And so their meals shifted from abundance to scarcity, from ordered agriculture to opportunistic foraging. One of the first staples to appear on the table was fish. Floodwaters teemed with them, driven into canals, trapped in pools, or caught in baskets by children along the shore. Nile perch, catfish, and tilapia were common catches. They were eaten fresh, roasted on small fires, or dried in the sun for storage. In times of too much water, the fish that overwhelmed the river became both a curse and a salvation. Whole villages survived on little more than roasted fish, and whatever bread, they could stretch from dwindling grain stores. But bread itself, the heart of the Egyptian diet, was in danger. When floods lingered, wheat and barley could not be sown on time, and shortages loomed. Ordinary families guarded their bread carefully, stretching it by mixing in other ingredients. Barley bread, darker and coarser than wheat bread, became common, but even barley could run short. In desperate times, people added ground acacia seeds or wild plants to the dough, creating loaves that were heavy, bitter, and hard on the teeth. Archaeologists have found ancient loaves embedded with such additions, a record of survival strategies etched in hardened crumbs. Vegetables became more important when fields were drowned. Lentils, beans, and chickpeas, stored from earlier harvests, provided protein that bread alone could not. Families soaked them in water and boiled them into thick stews, flavored with onions or garlic when available. Garlic, in particular, was prized not only for its taste, but for its supposed protective powers. Workers building pyramids were famously supplied with garlic and onions, believed to ward off sickness and grant strength. During floods, such humble vegetables became anchors of survival. Wild plants, too, entered the diet. Lotus roots, pulled from flooded marshes, were eaten boiled or roasted. Papyrus stalks, usually used for writing, could also be chewed or cooked in desperate times. The taste was fibrous, not pleasant, but it filled empty stomachs. Even weeds that sprang up along the riverbanks were harvested and cooked into thin broths, the kind of meals that left one unsatisfied but alive. Milk and cheese offered another lifeline. Cattle and goats, if not lost to the flood, continued to provide. Ordinary Egyptians might boil milk into sour curds, or press it into simple cheeses that kept longer than fresh milk. These were eaten with bread when possible, or alone when nothing else remained. In lean times, milk was more than food, it was security, a sign that the family still had livestock, still had something to trade. Dates, always abundant in Egypt, became essential during high floods. Date palms thrived even when fields lay underwater, their fruits hanging heavy above the devastation. Families gathered them, ate them fresh, or dried them for later. Dates provided energy quickly, and in times of scarcity, a handful of dates could mean the difference between hunger and strength. Children especially survived on them, their sticky fingers carrying the sweet fruit from hand to mouth while the adults rationed bread and beans. Beer, surprisingly, remained a staple even in hard years. Brewed from whatever grain could be spared, beer was weak, thick, and nourishing, more a porridge than a drink. When floods cut into supplies, beer became thinner, stretched with more water, sometimes flavored with dates to cover the weakness. Yet it remained part of the diet, a daily ritual that even scarcity could not erase. To drink beer was to feel human, to hold on to normality in a season when life was anything but normal. The household routine changed during floods. With fields underwater, farmers had no plowing or sowing to do. Time was spent repairing boats, reinforcing walls, or caring for livestock on whatever dry land remained. Meals were fewer, smaller, and often repetitive. Fish for breakfast, lentils for supper, dates for snacks, variety vanished, and monotony became another hardship. Hunger gnawed, not always from absence of food, but from the sameness of it. Children felt the shortages first. Bread was rationed, and the smallest members of the family were sometimes given watered-down porridge, made from whatever grains could be salvaged. Parents chewed tough foods first, softening them before passing them to children. It was a quiet act of survival, a transfer of strength from one generation to the next. The floods that brought hunger also brought disease. Stagnant water-bred mosquitoes, and sickness spread quickly. In these times, food was more than sustenance, it was medicine. Garlic, onions, honey, and herbs were eaten not only for nourishment but as protection. Ordinary Egyptians believed strongly in the healing power of food, and even in scarcity. They clung when the Nile gave too much. The poor adapted with remarkable resilience. They fished more, gathered more, ate what they once ignored. Yet the question always loomed, how long could the stores last? How long before the barley was gone, before the beans ran out, before even the dates were finished? The morning meal during a flood might look simple, a small piece of coarse bread, a handful of lentils, perhaps a roasted fish if the catch was good. Yet each meal carried unspoken questions. Would there be enough for tomorrow or the next week? Could the family survive until the waters retreated and the soil dried enough for planting? And so the thought lingers as you sit with an ordinary Egyptian family on a patch of dry ground, watching the floodwaters shimmer in the sunlight. When the river that gave life threatened to take it away, what quiet decisions of food and hunger determined who endured and who did not? When the Nile flooded too much, survival was never just about what a family could catch or gather. It was also about systems, networks of trade, religious institutions, and the decisions of rulers. Ordinary Egyptians lived within these systems, sometimes helped by them, sometimes exploited by them, but never free from their reach. To understand what they ate when the water lingered, we must look not only at fish pulled from canals, but also at the granaries, temples, and markets that mediated scarcity. At the center of this system stood the temple granaries. Temples in Egypt were more than places of worship. They were economic engines. Priests controlled vast tracts of land, herds of cattle, and enormous storehouses of grain. In times of excessive flooding, when the fields of ordinary farmers were ruined, temples often became the only source of food. Peasants came to the temple gates seeking rations. Sometimes they received barley or wheat in exchange for service, labor, or loyalty. Other times, the gates stayed closed and desperation deepened. For the state, managing famine was a matter of stability. Pharaohs who allowed their people to starve risked unrest, rebellion, or loss of divine legitimacy. Records carved in stone praise rulers who opened the granaries during floods, presenting themselves as guardians of the hungry. Yet archaeology also suggests that not all promises match reality. For many families, temple rations were small, uneven, or inaccessible. Bread might be thinner, beer weaker, portions smaller. Hunger was shared unevenly, its weight heavier on some shoulders than others. Markets, too, shifted in times of flood. Prices rose. A handful of barley could double in value. A jar of beer could cost more than a worker's daily wage. Traders who had stored surplus grain became powerful, while those with nothing to sell were left desperate. Fishmongers thrived, for fish was abundant in floodwaters. But not everyone wanted to live on fish alone. Wealthier families could afford to buy variety, while the poor bartered what little they had. Perhaps a chicken, perhaps a small ornament, perhaps even labor in exchange for bread. Hunger blurred the boundaries of value. Food itself took on a new role as currency. A loaf of bread might pay for a day's work repairing flood-damaged walls. A jar of beer might settle a debt. A bag of dates might purchase medicine or a promise of protection. Ordinary Egyptians, cut off in their fields, leaned on this barter economy, trading whatever they could for food that would last another day. Religious offerings became another paradox. Even during scarcity, Egyptians still left food for the gods. Temples expected bread, beer, and meat for rituals. Families might set aside a portion of their meager supplies to honor household gods, believing that neglecting them would bring worse misfortune. This sacrifice deepened hunger, but also gave meaning to it, transforming empty stomachs into acts of devotion. Food was never just physical, it was spiritual, even when scarce. The philosophy of hunger in Egypt was shaped by the Nile itself. People knew that the river's cycles were unpredictable. Some years it gave too little, bringing drought. Other years it gave too much, bringing floods. Survival depended on patience and endurance. Meals reflected this philosophy. To eat sparingly, to ration carefully, to accept monotony, these were not only necessities but virtues. Families who could stretch a sack of barley across a season were admired. Wastefulness was condemned. Bread crumbs were swept carefully, lentils measured precisely, dates divided with care. Every morsel mattered. And yet, hunger reshaped communities. Villages sometimes pooled resources, sharing fish or grain among neighbors. Extended families leaned on one another, taking in relatives displaced by floods. Meals became communal out of necessity, with large pots of lentil stew feeding dozens, each person receiving a thin portion, but at least something. In these times, food created bonds of solidarity. To share bread in scarcity was to affirm community. Still, hunger created tensions. Theft increased. Families guarded their stores, hiding sacks of grain in roof rafters or burying jars in the ground. Neighbors eyed each other's baskets, and disputes over rations flared. Survival was not always noble. It was also harsh, competitive, and desperate. Meals became battlegrounds, quiet but intense, shaping who endured and who did not. We should not imagine these floods as isolated tragedies. They repeated year after year, generation after generation. Egyptians lived with hunger as a recurring rhythm. Recipes adapted accordingly. Coarse bread baked with ground weeds, stew stretched in with more water, fish eaten even when spoiled, all were part of survival cuisine born from the river's moods. And in this rhythm lay the paradox of Egypt. The same river that built the world's most enduring civilization was also its greatest threat. Every loaf of bread eaten during a flood carried this contradiction. Grain made possible by the Nile's gift, but threatened by the Nile's excess. To eat was to negotiate with the river itself. So the thought lingers as you imagine a family at the edge of a flooded field, sharing a pot of lentils flavored with little more than salt and hope. Was survival in these years a result of human resilience, or merely the mercy of the river when it finally receded? When the waters finally receded, when the mud dried and the first green shoots of barley pushed through the soil again, life in Egypt seemed to return to normal. Families planted, harvested, baked, brewed, and filled their store jars once more. Yet the years of excessive flooding were not easily forgotten. Hunger carved itself into memory, and those memories shaped how Egyptians thought about food, about the river, and about survival itself. In the long arc of Egyptian history, floods were expected. They were part of the cycle, part of the Nile's gift and its danger. But years of too much water left scars. Families remember the meals of desperation, fish eaten raw in haste, barley stretched until it turned bitter, weeds boiled into broths that left more emptiness than nourishment. Children who grew up in such years carried those tastes with them into adulthood, shaping their habits of saving, storing, and rationing. This memory was not only personal, it became cultural. Egyptian hymns and prayers often spoke of the Nile with both gratitude and caution. The river gives, the river takes, the people believed. Offerings are happy. The god of the Nile often included bread and beer, the very foods most threatened by flood. To feed the god was to plead for balance. Food became prayer, and prayer became a way to transform fear into ritual. The state 2. Remembered. Pharaohs inscribed their generosity during famines on temple walls, boasting of how they opened the granaries and fed the people. These inscriptions were not just records, they were propaganda, reminders to future generations that kings were measured not only by victories in battle, but by their ability to keep bread in the mouths of their people when the river betrayed them. A full stomach was as much a sign of divine order as a pyramid rising against the sky. Ordinary Egyptians internalized this lesson in their daily habits. Storage became second nature. Families saved surplus dates, dried fish, and barley whenever possible, burying jars in cool earth, sealing them with mud to keep out pests. Even in years of abundance, meals were measured with care. Waste was almost unthinkable, for everyone knew that the next flood might be too high, the next harvest too late. Scarcity haunted abundance, shaping behavior long after the waters withdrew. The memory of hunger also shaped Egyptian myth and story. Tales of lean years of communities surviving on fish and beans were passed down alongside tales of gods and kings. These stories reminded listeners of resilience, of the power of patience, and of the endurance of ordinary people. In a civilization known for monuments and temples, it was the memory of small meals, the taste of coarse bread, the smell of lentil stew, that often carried the deepest lessons. And what of identity? For Egyptians, food was never just about nourishment. It was about balance between river and field, between gods and humans, between feast and famine. To eat during a flood was to acknowledge this balance in its most fragile state. A piece of barley bread dipped in garlic broth, a handful of dates shared among children, a mug of thin beer, all of these became symbols of survival, reminders that Egypt endured not only through kings and armies, but through the quiet resilience of families facing hunger together. We can still see traces of this resilience today. Archaeologists uncover loaves baked with odd mixtures, signs of substitution in years of shortage. In tomb paintings, offerings of bread and beer are depicted again and again, eternal symbols of what mattered most. Even the most splendid tombs of pharaohs include depictions of humble foods, reminders that the dead, like the living, relied on daily sustenance to endure. And so the story of what Egyptians ate during floods is not only a story of desperation. It is a story of adaptation, of creativity, of finding life in the margins. It reminds us that civilizations are not only measured by their monuments, but by the quiet persistence of people who find a way to eat, even when the river rises too high. As you sit with that thought, picture the river once more. It glitters under the sun, endless, eternal, flowing as it has for millennia. Families stand at its banks, casting nets, gathering fish, cooking stews of lentils and beans, waiting for the fields to dry. Hunger passes, but memory does not. The Nile gives, the Nile takes, and the people of Egypt endured both, meal by meal, flood by flood. So we end with a quiet reflection, one as steady as the river itself. When history remembers the great civilizations, should we measure them by their monuments of stone, or by the small, fragile meals that sustained ordinary people through seasons of hunger and flood? Imagine waking in the vastness of Han China, 2,000 years ago. The empire stretches from the deserts of Central Asia to the seas of the East, from the cold northern steppes to the warm rice fields of the South. It is a land of cities, markets, temples, and farms. But binding it together, holding its administration, armies, and trade route intact, was something less glamorous, less monumental, but no less essential: the network of couriers who carried messages and goods across dusty roads. At the break of dawn, before the market stirred, a courier was already awake. He tied his boots tightly, adjusted the simple tunic that marked his status, and prepared for another day on the road. He did not have the prestige of a soldier or the wealth of a merchant. His life was one of motion, of dust and distance. And yet, without him, the orders of the emperor would never reach the provinces. Tax reports would never return to capital, and alliances would unravel before they could even be formed. The roads of the Han dynasty were long, winding, and often treacherous. Built with packed earth, they stretched across plains, through mountains, and along rivers. Couriers traveled them constantly, carrying small wooden tablets, bamboo slips tied with cord, or even silk scrolls for the most important decrees. Each package bore seals, marks of authority that demanded respect. To lose or damage them was unthinkable. It was not merely a failure of duty, but an insult to the empire itself. Travel was slow, measured not in miles per hour, but in li per day. A courier on foot could cover perhaps 30 to 40 li, the equivalent of 10 to 15 modern miles. With a horse, the pace was faster, but not every courier had a horse. Horses were costly, reserved for urgent orders, high officials, or the military posts along the frontiers. Most couriers walked. Their boots wore down quickly, soles patched again and again, and the dust of the road clung to their clothes, marking them as men of constant travel. Meals were simple. A courier carried dried millet or rice, stored in small pouches, sometimes flavored with pickled vegetables if he was fortunate. He ate sparingly on the roadside, squatting in the dust, using his sleeve to wipe sweat before moving on. Inns existed, but not everywhere. More often, he slept in way stations, government posts built every few dozen miles, where he could find a mat, a fire, and sometimes a new pair of shoes or a replacement horse if he was lucky. These stations were the lifeline of the courier system, connecting one stretch of road to the next, creating a chain that reached from the heart of Chang'an to the distant borders. The dangers were many. Bandits haunted the less traveled roads, preying on lone travelers. Floods and landslides could wash away paths, leaving couriers stranded. In winter, snow and ice slowed them. In summer, heat pressed down relentlessly. Illness struck easily, and few couriers were wealthy enough to afford medicine. Yet the work went on, because the empire depended on it. The irony of their work was that couriers were rarely celebrated. Their names are absent from the grand histories, overshadowed by generals, scholars, and emperors. But every decree that reshaped the empire, every alliance secured with foreign kingdom, every tax shipment balance in the ledgers, each relied on the feet of men trudging across dusty roads. They were invisible threads, weaving the empire together. At the way stations, couriers sometimes met one another, sharing food and stories. They spoke of the endless monotony of roads, of the kindness or cruelty of innkeepers, of storms that left them soaked and shivering. They spoke, too, of the weight of the messages they carried. A bamboo slip might seem small, but could contain orders that moved armies or decrees that altered lives. The responsibility was heavy, even if their pay was not. And what of ordinary people watching them pass? Farmers working the fields saw the dust rising from the road and knew a courier was hurrying by. Children stared curiously, wondering where the man was going, what secrets he carried. Merchants gave way, recognizing the authority of sealed tablets marked with the government's hand. Couriers were both ordinary and extraordinary, common men doing uncommon tasks in the service of a vast machine. Yet for all their effort, one question always lingered as the sun sank and the courier prepared for another night on the road. In a world where emperors were remembered in stone and scholars in books, who would remember the men who walked endlessly, carrying the words that made empire possible? If you picture the Han Dynasty as a great body, then the emperor was its mind, the officials its hands, and the farmers its stomach. But the couriers, the men trudging along endless roads with bamboo slips tied at their belts, were its arteries. They carried the lifeblood of the empire, information. Without them, the mind could not command the hands, and the body would falter. The courier road served three essential purposes: administration, military power, and trade. Each purpose relied on the same dusty paths, the same weary boots, but together they wove the empire into a coherent whole. The Han bureaucracy was vast, with officials spread across counties, commanderies, and provinces. Records were kept meticulously: tax registers, census counts, court rulings, land surveys. But these documents meant little if they remained where they were written. They had to move constantly between local offices and the central government in Chang'an or Luoyang. Couriers were the carriers of this endless paperwork. A bamboo slip might record how many pigs were born in a village, how many bushels of grain were stored in a county granary, or how many men were fit for military conscription. To us, such details seemed dull, but to the empire they were the pulse of survival. Taxation and labor quotas depended on them. If the slips did not arrive, the system broke. Each courier understood that a bundle of bamboo slips was more than wood and ink. It was the weight of an entire community's labor, the evidence of their contribution to the empire. To misplace them was unthinkable. To deliver them late was dangerous. And so they walked, mile after mile, carrying the bureaucratic lifeblood that sustained the empire's order. Beyond paperwork lay the urgency of war. The Han dynasty fought constantly along its frontiers, clashed with the Xiongnu in the north, pushing trade and influence westward, and guarding its borders against raids. Armies moved slowly, but orders needed to move quickly. A single message might command an entire legion to shift position, to march, to retreat. Couriers carried such orders, riding horses when available, changing mounts at way stations, rushing against time. For urgent military dispatches, the system resembled a relay. One courier rode until exhausted, then handed the message to another at the next station, who continued without pause. In this way, an order could move hundreds of miles in days, faster than any soldier could march. The dust of these military couriers was the dust of history itself. Victories and defeats often turned not only on generals and strategies, but on whether a message arrived in time. A delayed courier might mean an ambush, a lost battle, or a garrison left without reinforcements. In their silent urgency, couriers carried the fate of armies in their satchels. The Han couriers also tied into something even larger than the empire itself, the beginnings of the Silk Road. As caravans moved westward, carrying silk, spices, and goods across deserts, the empire needed reliable communication with distant trade posts and foreign envoys. Couriers brought news of caravan arrivals, reported on band activity, and relayed requests from merchants. They also carried diplomatic letters, silk scrolls sealed with wax, destined for kings and chiefs far beyond China's traditional borders. A courier might walk for months, delivering a message to a ruler in Central Asia, his presence a living thread between cultures. These exchanges mattered deeply. Trade brought wealth into the empire, but also brought alliances and information. To know whether a neighboring chief was hostile or friendly, whether a caravan had arrived safely or been plundered, was to know whether the empire prospered or suffered. The couriers carried this knowledge, as silently and reliably as a river carries silt. All of this, administration, war, trade, rested on distance. The Han Empire was vast, and the farther a courier traveled, the heavier the weight of his duty became. Some walked mountain passes where snow clung to the rocks. Others trudged through deserts where water was scarce and sand blinded the eyes. The message never changed: carry, deliver, return. At way stations, couriers briefly escaped the road's loneliness. Here, they shared meals with soldiers, farmers, and fellow travelers. They ate millet gruel, drank weak tea or water, and sometimes warmed themselves with fires built from dried dung or scrubwood. These moments of pause were fleeting. Soon, the road called again and the journey continued. The empire understood the fragility of the system. Edicts were strict. A courier who lost or delayed a message could face punishment, even death, if the loss endangered the empire. The weight of bamboo slips was light, but the weight of responsibility was crushing. What made this system remarkable was not its glamour, but its ordinariness. Couriers were not celebrated heroes. They were men of the road, anonymous in the grand sweep of history. Yet their steps stitched together an empire. Every tax order that fed a granary, every decree that mobilized an army, every diplomatic scroll that opened a new alliance, all depended on dusty boots and weary feet. Without them, the empire would have unraveled into silence. And so, as you picture a courier trudging along the edge of a desert, a bamboo slip tied carefully at his belt, one question lingers. How many of the great decisions of history, victories, alliances, laws, were decided not in palaces or battlefields, but on the reliability of one man's footsteps on a lonely road? The couriers of the Han dynasty lived lives of motion. Day after day, they walked roads that stretched into horizon after horizon, carrying slips of bamboo and silk scrolls that held the will of the emperor. Yet, like the dust that clung to their boots, their presence settled quietly unrecorded, overshadowed by generals, poets, and emperors. And when the Han fell, their roads changed too. The end of the Han dynasty in the 3rd century was marked by fragmentation, warlords, and civil strife. The vast system of way stations and courier routes, the arteries of the empire, was broken apart. Some stations burned, others were. Abandoned, their walls crumbling back into earth. Couriers who once carried decrees of emperors now found themselves without steady work, or pressed into the service of competing warlords. The silence of the collapsed system was deafening. Yet not all was lost. Later dynasties remembered the necessity of couriers, even if the Han's vast network could not be maintained in its original form. The Tang dynasty, centuries later, revived and expanded road systems, tying them to the growing Silk Road. Mongol rulers would eventually create the famed Yam postal system across Eurasia, echoing the relay methods first used by the Han. Each later empire built upon the lessons learned in Han China. That power required not only armies and taxes, but also men who carried words across distance. Archaeology preserves faint traces of these men. Excavations of ancient way stations reveal fire pits, clay bowls, and scraps of bamboo slips. In some places, faint ruts remain in the earth, marks of centuries of feet, hooves, and cartwheels pressing into the same packed roads. The grand records do not mention the names of the couriers, but the land remembers their passing. Every worn path was once a story of a man, a message, and a duty fulfilled. The couriers also left a legacy in memory. Even in folklore, the figure of the tireless messenger appears, a symbol of endurance, duty, and anonymity. In later Chinese proverbs, swiftness and reliability are praised with images of men who run the road like the wind. These sayings may not preserve names, but they preserve the role, the recognition that empires are sustained not only by the famous, but by the forgotten. Why does this matter to us now? Because the couriers remind us of a truth about civilization. Great systems are built not only on monuments and rulers, but on ordinary labor that goes unseen. The Han Dynasty's achievements, its expansion, its bureaucracy, its diplomacy, were all dependent on the daily motion of men who walked dusty roads with slips of bamboo tied at their belts. Their work was repetitive, tiring, and thankless. Yet without them, the empire would have fallen into silence far sooner. Think, too, of the fragility of their system. A lost message, a delayed courier, a flooded road. Any of these could ripple outward, changing outcomes of battles, delaying aid, altering history in ways never recorded. The empire appeared mighty, but it balanced on the reliability of men whose names we will never know. And so, as we close this story, imagine standing on a forgotten road in China, the sun high above, the earth cracked with age. You hear nothing now but the wind through grass. Yet if you listen closely, you might almost catch it. The echo of footsteps, the creak of leather straps, the faint rasp of breath as a courier pushes onward, carrying words that once bound an empire together. And then ask yourself, when our own age is long gone, will historians remember our rulers and monuments, or will they search, as we do now, for the quiet footsteps of those who kept the world running, unseen and uncelebrated? Long before parchment, before paper, before the ink scrolls of later empires, there were small lumps of clay, damp, heavy in the hand. They were pressed with reeds and left to dry in the sun. On them were carved numbers, names, and lists, records so ordinary they rarely appear in histories of kings and conquests. Yet these clay tablets, dull and brittle, were the foundations of civilization. Imagine yourself in a dusty street of Ur or Lagash or Babylon. It is midday, the sun pressing down on flat-roof houses and bustling markets. Amid the calls of traders selling fish, grain, and wool, a different figure makes his way, the tax collector. He is not armed like a soldier, nor revered like a priest. He carries no golden staff. What he carries instead is a satchel of clay tablets and a stylus of reed. His task is not glorious, but it is necessary. He records what every family owes, and what every family pays. Taxes in Mesopotamia were rarely paid in coin. Coinage itself was a late arrival. Instead, taxes were collected in goods: barley, sheep, fish, oil, wool. The tax collector walked from household to household, or supervised in the temple courtyards, noting down what each family contributed. A sack of barley was weighed, a sheep counted, a jar of oil sealed. The reed stylus pressed into clay. One mark for barley, another for sheep, a symbol for oil. Ordinary goods became enduring records. Clay was abundant in the river valleys of the Tigris and Euphrates. Paper did not exist, parchment was rare, but clay could be found everywhere. When damp, it was soft enough to inscribe. When dried, it hardened into permanence. Thousands upon thousands of these tablets survive today, stacked in museum drawers. They record not battles or myths, but the quiet accounting of daily life. How much grain a farmer owed, how many sheep passed through the gates, how many jars of beer were brewed for laborers. For the ordinary farmer, the presence of the tax collector was a moment of tension. He might bring barley to the courtyard, watching anxiously as it was measured. Too little, and he risked punishment. Too much, and he lost food his family needed. The clay tablet held no sympathy. Once pressed, the record was fixed, and the state's memory was longer than any man's. A dispute could be settled years later simply by unearthing a tablet from storage. In a world without paper or digital ledgers, clay gave permanence to power. The system was not only about extraction. Taxes built the great works of Mesopotamia, the irrigation canals that fed the fields, the temples that rose in honor of the gods, the armies that guarded the cities. Yet to the farmer, these distant benefits mattered little compared to the immediate weight of losing grain or livestock. Meals were thinner because of taxes. Children ate less because barley was handed to the temple storehouses. Survival was measured against the state's hunger. Still, there was order in this system. The tablets, monotonous as they seem, created predictability. Families knew what was expected each season. Villages knew how much they must collectively provide. The clay kept memory, and memory prevented chaos. To eat one's bread in Mesopotamia was always to eat under the shadow of tax. Every loaf of barley bread carried within the silent mark of a collector's reed stylus, impressed weeks earlier in a damp tablet. Picture the tax collector sitting at a wooden table in the temple courtyard, surrounded by baskets of grain and bleating sheep. His hand moves steadily, pressing marks into clay. He speaks little, for the tablets do the speaking. Around him, men argue, women plead, scribes tally. The air smells of dust, sweat, and animals. And in the background rises a ziggurat, the step temple that watches over everything. Even the gods, it seems, require taxes to sustain their houses. What survives of these moments today are the tablets themselves. Some bear the fingerprints of the very collectors who wrote them. Others show corrections, where a stylus scraped away a mistake and pressed a new mark. They are not grand or beautiful, but they are honest. They reveal the machinery of civilization in its most basic form. People giving, scribes recording, states storing, gods watching. And so the question lingers, as you hold in your mind the image of a clay tablet dry in the sun. Was civilization truly built by kings and armies, or by the quiet, repetitive work of tax collectors pressing reeds into clay, turning barley and sheep into records that outlived them all? The tax collector pressing his reed stylus into clay was not merely an accountant. He was part of a machine that stretched from the smallest barley field to the tallest ziggurat. Every mark in clay linked the sweat of a farmer's labor to the wealth of kings, priests, and soldiers. To understand what ordinary Mesopotamians ate, or did not eat, we must follow the clay tablets from household courtyards to the granaries of temples, and from there to construction sites and battlefields that consumed the wealth of the land. Religion in Mesopotamia was inseparable from administration. Temples were not only houses of worship, they were also the largest landowners and the greatest tax collectors. Families brought offerings of barley, sheep, and fish to the temple not only as piety, but as obligation. These offerings fed priests, singers, guards, and the endless stream of workers who maintained the sacred buildings. Clay tablets recorded every delivery: 3 sheep from Lilidin, 1 jar of oil from the household of Shamhat, 2 baskets of dates from the orchard of Otani. Each line seems dull, but together they reveal the flow of food into the temple economy. Ordinary people went hungry, so that gods might be honored daily with bread, beer, and roasted meat. Yet temples also returned some of this wealth. In times of famine or flood, priests distributed rations from their storehouses. Workers who dug irrigation canals or built walls received barley measured out in handfuls. Women spinning wool for temple cloth were paid in bread and beer. Taxes taken in one season reappeared as wages in another, circulating through society. The clay kept these cycles visible, ensuring that temples remembered what they owed as much as what they had collected. The palace was another hungry mouth. Kings needed grain and livestock to feed soldiers, builders, and administrators. Taxes filled the storerooms of the state, funding campaigns of conquest and the maintenance of walls and canals. The clay tablets reveal this too. Lists of rations for soldiers, of supplies sent to the front, of bricks baked for palace walls, all begin with marks of taxation. When a king boasted of building a canal or conquering a city, the true foundation was barley pressed into tablets months before. Without grain from farmers, there were no armies. Without sheep, there were no cloaks or tents. Without taxes, the king's power was empty. For the ordinary family, this meant a simple truth. Every loaf of bread they baked carried a hidden portion for the palace. Taxes made meals thinner, meat rarer, beer weaker. Yet they also created the structures that allowed society to function: irrigation systems, city defenses, caravan security. The paradox of tax was this: it took from the poor to feed the powerful, yet without it the poor themselves might starve in chaos. Not all tablets were equal. Some record the payments of wealthy households, large deliveries of sheep, jars of oil, bundles of wool. These families paid more, but they also had more to give. Others show the meager contributions of small farmers, struggling to provide a sack of barley. For them, the burden was heavier, for a single sack might mean the difference between plenty and hunger. The tablets show fines, too. If a family failed to pay, or tried to cheat the measure, the penalty was steep: more grain next season, and extra sheep, sometimes forced labor. Injustice was carved into clay as deeply as fairness. Over time, this system created visible inequality. The rich grew richer, trading grain for silver, hiring workers to till their fields. The poor sank deeper, struggling each season to meet the collector's demands. The clay preserved their struggle without pity. For the tax collector, a mark was a mark, whether it represented a wealthy man's 10 sheep or a poor family's only goat. Taxes did not always vanish into palaces and temples. Much of it returned to society as wages, but always in controlled portions. Laborers hired to build canals, walls, or ziggurats received daily rations of barley and beer. One tablet might read, "To the workers, 5 measures of barley, 10 jars of beer." These were wages, but they were also survival. To work for the state was to live from the same stores one had filled through taxes a year before. Meals on these projects were monotonous but sustaining. Workers received bread, porridge, and beer. Occasionally dates or onions added flavor, but meat was rare. These meals were not feasts but fuel, measured portions calculated to keep bodies working. The clay reveals its exactness: rations tallied, divided, reduced when shortages loomed. The state fed, but never more than necessary. Control of grain was control of power. Kings who opened storehouses during famine were praised as protectors. Kings who failed to feed their people were cursed as neglectful. Even rebellion was tied to food. Hungry families were less loyal, less willing to submit to rulers who took without giving. The clay tablets, silent list of numbers, were in truth political weapons. For the ordinary man, though, this politics was felt in meals. His barley ration determined whether his children ate thick bread or thin porridge, whether beer was hearty or watery. Each bite was shaped by distant decisions recorded in clay. The scene is clear. A tax collector sits with stylus in hand, recording another delivery. Around him stand men weary from fields, women clutching baskets, children tugging at their sleeves. Above them rise the walls of the temple, the palace, the city. The clay tablet before him does not show their hunger, but it decides it. And so one question lingers. When we look back at Mesopotamian civilization, do we see only its ziggurats and kings? Or do we also see the invisible hunger etched quietly into clay? The price of bread paid by the hand of farmers to sustain gods and rulers alike? The courtyards where tax collectors once sat are empty now. The ziggurats have crumbled. The canals are silted, and the palaces are ruins. But the clay tablets remain. Thousands of them lie in museums, their marks still sharp after 4,000 years. The men who press reeds into damp clay are forgotten, their names lost, but their work endures. Civilization itself is recorded in these brittle fragments. To hold a Mesopotamian tax tablet today is to touch the heartbeat of an ancient world. You see the wedge-shaped impressions, rows of lines and dots that once meant 3 sheep, 10 measures of barley, 1 jar of oil. They are not poetry, not myth, not epic. They are accounts, ordinary records of ordinary obligations. And yet they tell us more about how people lived than any royal inscription. For they show us what was eaten, what was stored, what was lost to state. Archaeologists studying these tablets have reconstructed entire economies. They can trace how much barley fed a worker, how much wool was spun, how many animals passed through a city gate. They can see years of plenty, when taxes flowed smoothly, and years of shortage, when entries grew thin. They can even glimpse the fingerprints of collectors and scribes, pressed accidentally into the clay as they worked. The human presence lingers, quiet but undeniable. The tablets outlive the kings they served. Sargon, Hammurabi, Nebuchadnezzar, all are gone, their palaces reduced to dust. But the small tablets recording sheep and grain remain. The irony is striking. The monuments built by kings to immortalize themselves have often crumbled, while the boring tablets of tax collectors endure. History is written not only in epic stone, but in humble clay. For ordinary people, the tablets represented power. To see one in the hands of a collector was to feel the weight of obligation. To have your name inscribed was to be remembered by the state, not by choice but by necessity. Yet now, those same marks that once bound a farmer in fear are what bind him to memory. We know his sheep, his barley, his contribution. His meals are long gone, but the record of them survives. The tablets also reveal resilience. Year after year, despite floods, famines, and invasions, families continue to pay, to eat, to endure. Civilization persisted not because kings built walls, but because farmers kept sowing barley and tax collectors kept pressing styluses into clay. The cycle of taking and giving, of hunger and ration, of obligation survival. This is what made cities possible. And yet, there is a haunting truth here. These tablets remind us that civilization has always been built on unequal exchanges. The meals of priests and kings were richer because the meals of farmers were thinner. The bread eaten at the top of society was baked with grain taken from the bottom. The clay does not lie. It shows us the quiet cost of greatness. Still, to dismiss this system as only exploitation would be to miss its other side. The taxes also built the canals that watered the fields, the walls that protected the cities, the temples that gave meaning to life. Without taxes, chaos threatened. With them, order prevailed, even if imperfectly. The clay tablets, dull and bureaucratic, were in fact the glue of civilization. So what lesson lingers? Perhaps this: greatness is preserved not only in triumphs, but in the ordinary. The meals taxed, the jars counted, the sheep tallied. These are as much a part of history as battles and conquests. The survival of civilization is measured not only in monuments, but in the daily exchange of food, labor, and record. And so, as you imagine a tax collector pressing one last mark into clay, setting the tablet to dry in the sun, ask yourself, when our own age has passed, what will remain? Will it be our monuments, or will it be the small, ordinary records, the receipts, the ledgers, the digital marks that tell future generations how we truly lived? The sagas speak of battles, of raids across the sea, of kings and warriors who carved names into history. But the truth of Viking survival lay not only in swords and ships, but in the humble work of farmers preparing for the long winters. Before a sword could be swung, a body had to be fed. Before a voyage could be taken, provisions had to be stored. And among the most important of those provisions was cheese. Imagine a small Viking farmstead in late summer. The fields of barley sway in the wind. The sheep and cattle graze heavily, and the air smells faintly of hay drying in the sun. Inside the farmhouse, women and servants are busy with one of the most ordinary yet essential tasks: turning milk into something that would last. Fresh milk soured quickly, especially in the days before cold storage. But milk transformed into butter or cheese could endure the long months, when snow blanketed the fields and rivers froze solid. Cheese-making in Viking households was both simple and laborious. The milk, cow, goat, or sheep, was poured into wooden tubs. Rennet, often taken from the stomach of a slaughtered calf or lamb, was added to curdle it. Slowly, the milk separated into curds and whey. The curds were gathered, pressed by hand or with wooden boards, and salted. This was the beginning of cheese, though not the delicate wheels of modern dairies. Viking cheese was coarse, dense, and practical, designed not for taste but for survival. The pressing was essential. Moisture was the enemy of preservation. The more liquid removed, the longer the cheese could endure. Farmers used woven cloths to squeeze out whey, or placed heavy stones on the curds to force the liquid away. The resulting block of cheese was firm, almost tough, but it held the summer's milk in a form that could be eaten months later. Salt, too, was vital. It was rubbed into the cheese to slow decay, to harden the surface, and to protect against mold. Salt was not always abundant in Viking lands, and so it was precious, traded for with neighboring settlements, or gathered from coastal flats. To sprinkle salt on cheese was to invest in winter survival, a small act of foresight that might mean the difference between hunger and endurance. Once pressed and salted, the cheese had to be stored. Viking farms did not have cellars like later European estates, but they used pits, cool storage rooms, or wooden shelves placed in the darkest, driest parts of the house. Sometimes cheeses were hung in cloth sacks near the rafters, where smoke from the hearth dried and flavored them. This smoke acted as another preservative, coating the cheese in a bitter but protective layer. The work of making and storing cheese was daily in summer. Each morning, milk was gathered, curdled, pressed, salted, and stored. The rhythm repeated endlessly, a cycle of labor that filled shelves with food for the dark months. For women especially, this was survival's craft. While men hunted, raided, or farmed the fields, women controlled the dairy, ensuring that households had enough stored food to face the winter. Meals during winter depended heavily on these summer stores. A slice of hard cheese with bread, a spoonful melted into a porridge, or a crumb added to stews, all carried the taste of summer milk into the coldest season. The cheese was not luxurious, but it was nourishment, dense with fat and protein. Children gnawed on it. Travelers carried it. Warriors packed it for voyages. Cheese was not glamour. It was fuel. But the making of cheese was more than mere practicality. It carried symbolism, too. Cheese was offered to guests as a sign of welcome, to gods in small rituals, to ancestors in memory. A block of cheese was a reminder that survival was not only about strength in battle, but about patience, labor, and foresight. To prepare cheese in summer was to prepare life for winter. And yet, one question lingered over every block stored away on shelves. Would it be enough? When the winds howled and the snow lay heavy, would the summer's cheese hold hunger at bay, or would the shelf grow empty before the first green shoots returned? The Viking farmstead was a world of routine, milking, curdling, pressing, storing. But cheese did not always remain within the farmhouse walls. It traveled across markets, across seas, and across tables where alliances were forged over shared meals. Cheese, humble as it was, became part of the larger story of Viking life, economy, and culture. In summer and autumn, when households had made more cheese than they needed for winter, surplus blocks appeared in village markets. Farmers carried them wrapped in cloth, stacked in baskets, or tied in bundles. The cheeses were hard, salted, and durable, easy to transport, unlikely to spoil. In the markets, cheese joined butter, wool, hides, and dried fish as everyday goods. Housewives haggled over prices, weighing a block of cheese against jars of honey or bundles of herbs. Merchants purchased in bulk, reselling in distant settlements. For poorer families, trading cheese might bring in salt, iron tools, or even small luxuries like glass beads. For wealthier farmers, surplus cheese became a means of building status. To have enough not only to survive the winter, but to trade was a mark of prosperity. When Vikings set sail for trade, exploration, or raiding, cheese was among their provisions. A hard block could endure weeks at sea, surviving damp air and rough handling. Warriors gnawed on it alongside dried fish and flatbread, washing it down with ale or watered mead. It was not glamorous, but it kept hunger at bay while ships pitched across the North Sea or coasted along unfamiliar shores. For traders venturing as far as the rivers of Russia or the markets of British Isles, cheese was both food and trade item. Archaeological finds suggest that dairy products, including butter and cheese, were exchanged in distant lands. Imagine a Viking trader setting a block of salted cheese on a foreign table, offering a taste of northern survival to strangers far from home. The endurance of cheese mirrored the endurance of the voyagers themselves, tough, dry, practical, and unyielding. Just as the Viking longship was built for distance and hardship, so too was the cheese that sustained its crew. Cheese also appeared in a more symbolic space, the feast hall. While roasted meats, ale, and meat dominated banquets, cheese was not absent. Blocks of stored cheese, softened near the hearth or sliced onto wooden platters, reminded guests of the household's wealth and foresight. To serve cheese in winter was to show that the farmstead had planned well, that its shelves remained full even in the cold. In some sagas, food itself is tied to honor. The host who provided generously was remembered as noble, while the one whose table was thin became a figure of scorn. Cheese, though humble, carried weight in this context. It was proof of prosperity, of women's labor, of summer's abundance carried forward into the depths of winter. A feast without cheese suggested mismanagement, while one that offered plenty spoke of strength. Cheese was not only food, it was sometimes medicine. Vikings believed that dairy products could restore strength, ease weakness, or heal the sick. Cheese, dense with fat and protein, was seen as strengthening food, given to children, the elderly, or the ill. In folk practices, it was even offered in small charms, crumbled on thresholds, placed in offerings, or invoked in protective rituals. For the gods, too, dairy mattered. While the sagas emphasize mead as the drink of Valhalla, dairy products symbolize the everyday nourishment of mortals. Offering cheese to local spirits or ancestors was a way to connect the living to the unseen, to remind gods and ghosts alike that humans labor to preserve what the land provided. Yet cheese also revealed inequality. Wealthier farmers with larger herds and access to salt stored more and finer cheeses. Their shelves were lined with blocks that lasted the winter and beyond. Poorer households had less milk, less salt, fewer hands to work. Their cheeses were smaller, their stores fewer, their winters leaner. Archaeological remains suggest that while cheese was common, its abundance varied. In some settlements, families lived through winter with shelves well stocked. In others, by spring, their cheeses were gone, and they turned to fish, then porridge or foraging. Cheese thus marked not only foresight, but status. To offer cheese to guests in January was to proclaim plenty. To have none by February was to confess scarcity. For all its practicality, cheese carried a burden. It was monotonous. Imagine eating the same hard slices day after day, week after week, as snow lay heavy and fields remained frozen. Children grew tired of it. Adults longed for fresh milk, green vegetables, or warm bread. But the monotony was endured because survival demanded it. Cheese was not about pleasure. It was about persistence. In this way, cheese became a quiet metaphor for Viking endurance itself. It was hard, plain, sometimes bitter. It lacked variety. But it lasted. It filled stomachs when little else did. It gave strength when the world outside seemed hostile. And it proved, in its humble way, that survival was built on patience as much as courage. So the question lingers as you picture a Viking table in the dark of winter, a block of cheese set beside bread and dried fish. Did the greatness of the Viking age come only from raiders and kings, or also from the quiet foresight of farmers who preserved milk against the cold, ensuring that hunger never silenced their households? The Viking age is remembered for its ships and raids, for kings and battles sung in sagas. Yet beneath the clang of swords and the creak of longships lay the quieter labor of survival. The cheese pressed in summer, stored on shelves, and eaten in the deep dark of winter. Without this humble work, the warriors could not have sailed, the families could not have endured, and the sagas themselves might never have been told. Archaeologists have uncovered traces of Viking daring across Scandinavia. Fragments of clay pots with milk residue, wooden tools used for pressing curds, and even hardened lumps of ancient dairy products. These finds confirm what the sagas only hint at, that dairy was central to daily life. Cheese left its mark not only on shelves but in soil chemistry. Layers of settlement sites reveal residues of milk fats, proof that households were constantly transforming milk into forms that could survive the winter. Each discovery whispers of women bent over tubs, of stones pressing curds, of salt rubbed carefully into surfaces. The archaeology of cheese is not glamorous, but it reveals the heartbeat of survival. Cheese also lingered in cultural practices. In Northern Europe, traditions of hard, salted, and smoked cheeses persisted long after the Viking Age. Folk tales spoke of magical cows that never ran dry, or of cheeses offered to spirits in exchange for protection. These stories carried forward the deep association between dairy and survival, between milk and endurance. In Iceland, where winters were harsher still, dairy preservation became even more essential. Skyr, a cultured dairy product akin to cheese or yogurt, was stored in barrels and eaten throughout the year. Its roots stretch back to Viking times, a living link to the survival foods of 1,000 years ago. On a long January night, when snow pressed against wooden walls and winds howled across the fjords, the family meal was simple: a block of cheese cut with knife, bread baked from barley flour, dried fish pulled from stores. The children ate in silence. The adults chewed slowly, each mouthful a reminder of summer's labor. Hunger was kept at bay not by feast or luxury, but by foresight. Cheese was not celebrated. It did not inspire songs or sagas. Yet its absence was felt more than its presence. A farmstead that failed to store enough cheese faced hunger, perhaps even death. A farmstead with shelves still lined in March was seen as fortunate, prosperous, well-managed. Cheese was a measure of foresight, of patience, of survival. The act of storing cheese also shaped Viking identity. It reflected a people who thrived not only through courage in battle, but through endurance at home. Their strength was not just in sword and sails, but in their ability to plan ahead, to wrest nourishment from harsh landscapes, to survive where others might falter. In this sense, cheese was a quiet expression of Viking resilience. It turned perishable milk into lasting food. It turned fleeting summer into enduring sustenance. And it turned the daily labor of women and farmers into a foundation upon which warriors and kings built their power. Even today, in the cheeses of Scandinavia, hard, smoked, salted, we taste echoes of the Viking world. Every slice carries with it the memory of survival in a frozen land, of families gathered around hearths, of shelves lined with blocks pressed months earlier. It is a taste not of luxury but of endurance, of the quiet determination that allowed life to persist through the darkest winters. And so we close this story with a thought. When we picture Vikings, we see warriors in iron helmets, ships crescent waves, halls filled with mead and laughter. But behind those images was always the simple taste of cheese, hard, plain, salted, and enduring. It was not heroic, it was not glorious, but it was survival. And the question lingers. When history remembers great peoples, do we honor only their battles and kings, or do we also remember the ordinary foods, the cheese, the bread, the beer that carried them to the silence of winter? If you wandered the streets of medieval London in the 13th or 14th century, you would smell it before you saw it. The scent of bread, fresh from the ovens, drifting over crooked lanes and wooden stalls. Bread was a heartbeat of the city, eaten by everyone from apprentices to aldermen, from washerwomen to wealthy merchants. But bread was never simply bread. Every loaf carried with it the weight of law, the anxiety of hunger, and the ever-present eye of the market inspectors who measured and weighed each piece. Bread was so essential to daily life that it became one of the first foods to be regulated by law. As early as 1266, under King Henry III, the size of bread and ale was enforced, a statute that dictated how much a loaf should weigh, depending on the price of grain. The idea was simple. As grain prices rose or fell, bakers had to adjust the size of their loaves to match, keeping the price of a loaf stable. In practice, it meant that every piece of bread sold in London had to be weighed against official standards. Too light, and the baker was fined, or worse, shamed in the stocks before angry crowds. Imagine the scene in Cheapside, London's bustling market district. Stalls lined the street, each with baskets of bread. Round loaves of maslin, a mix of wheat and rye. Coarse rye bread for the poor, finer white loaves for the wealthy. Customers crowd forward, clutching coins or bartering goods. And beside them stand the inspectors, officials charged with enforcing the assize. They carry weights and balances, their job to ensure that no baker cheats the hungry by shaving ounces from a loaf. For the ordinary Londoner, bread was survival. A laborer's diet might consist of little more than bread, ale, and perhaps onions or cheese. If bread was too light, it meant hunger. If it was adulterated with sand or chaff, it meant sickness. The market became a battleground of trust. Bakers promised honest loaves, inspectors measured them, and customers watched with suspicion. Bread itself reflected class. The wealthy bought manchet bread, made from fine white flour, soft and delicate. The poor bought black bread, dark and coarse, made from rye or barley. Most people ate maslin bread, somewhere in between, dense, chewy, sustaining. In every case, the loaf was weighed, and its weight became a measure not only of food, but of fairness. Punishments for cheating were severe. A baker who sold underweight loaves might be fined, placed in the pillory, or even dragged to the streets with loaves hung around his neck as a sign of shame. In the worst cases, he might be banned from baking altogether. The people of London took their bread seriously, and the city enforced it with equal seriousness. Yet, despite the laws, disputes were constant. Grain prices fluctuated with harvests, with storms, with wars. In times of scarcity, loaves grew smaller, thinner, harder. Families complained, crowds muttered, riots sometimes broke out. Bread was not only food, it was a political barometer. A light loaf was a warning sign, a symbol that hunger was creeping closer. Inside the bakeries, the work was endless. Bakers rose in the darkness, kneading dough by candlelight, feeding great wooden ovens with bundles of faggots. Sweat poured as they worked, for bread had to be ready by dawn. Apprentices carried baskets to the market, shouting the freshness of their wares. And always in the back of their minds, they remembered the inspectors and their scales. One miscalculation, one light loaf, could mean ruin. The irony was that bakers themselves often lived on the edge of hunger. Flour was costly, ovens consumed fuel, fines were frequent. Many bakers struggled to survive even as they fed the city. The bread they sold was a bread they themselves could rarely afford in its finest form. And so, bread in old London was never only bread. It was weighed, measured, inspected, fought over. Every loaf was a small contract between baker and buyer, overseen by the law, enforced by the market, and tested by the stomachs of the people. And as you imagine scales tipping in Cheapside, a loaf placed carefully, the inspector's eyes narrowing, the crowd leaning closer, one question lingers. When hunger pressed hard, did the scales measure fairness, or did they measure the desperation of a city always teetering on the edge of want? Bread in medieval London was more than a daily meal. It was currency, politics, and the heartbeat of the city's economy. Every loaf that passed over a market stall carried not just flour and water, but the tension between rulers and ruled, wealth and poverty, survival and scarcity. London's economy ran on bread. Wages were often calculated against the price of loaf, for it was the surest measure of how far a worker's earnings could stretch. When grain was plentiful, loaves were large, bellies were full, and unrest was quiet. But when harvest failed or trade faltered, loaves shrank, and so did patience. Bakers themselves depended on a fragile balance. They purchased flour from millers, who ground it from grain brought by merchants, who in turn depended on farmers and the fickleness of weather. A bad harvest in the countryside rippled outward to the city. Merchants raised prices. Millers demanded more. Bakers struggled, and customers felt cheated. Bread was thus a mirror of larger forces: climate, trade, taxation, all measured in the weight of a single loaf. The city government knew this well. The assize of bread and ale was not just law but politics in action. By fixing bread's price and weight, officials tried to prevent famine from turning into rebellion. To enforce it, inspectors patrolled markets and bakeries, scales in hand. But enforcement was uneven. Wealthy bakers could sometimes bribe officials, slipping a coin to look the other way. Poor bakers had no such protection. They were the ones dragged into pillories, loaves strung around their necks while the crowd jeered. These spectacles were not only punishment, they were theater, designed to reassure the hungry that justice was being done, even if hunger itself remained. Kings, too, understood the politics of bread. Chronicles record monarchs ordering grain imports or distributing bread in times of crisis. Gestures meant to calm unrest and project care for the poor. Yet these acts were often more symbolic than sufficient. A few wagons of grain could not feed all of London, but they could quiet tempers long enough to preserve order. When hunger grew too sharp, the people acted. Bread riots erupted in London across centuries, sparked by loaves too light, prices too high, or rumors of hoarding. Crowds stormed bakeries, overturned stalls, and demanded fairness. To seize bread from a market was not seen as theft, but as justice, a correction of imbalance. Records describe women, often the ones most responsible for feeding families, at the front of these protests. They shouted at bakers, weighed loaves in their hands, and sometimes marched to city halls to demand intervention. Bread was their battleground, their proof of fairness or betrayal. In these moments, the weighing of bread was not only done by officials, but by the people themselves. A loaf held up in protest, a demand shouted in the street, became a test of whether rulers remembered their duty to the hungry. Bread's importance reached into the spiritual as well. The church saw bread as sacred, both in the Eucharist, where it became the body of Christ, and in almsgiving, where it symbolized charity. To bake bread for the poor was a holy act. To deny it was a sin. Confraternities and guilds sometimes distributed loaves to the needy, a small gesture that echoed the divine gift of sustenance. Yet even here, and the quality showed itself. The bread given in charity was often coarse, dark, and heavy, while the wealthy consumed fine white loaves. Even in ritual, bread reminded people of their place. For ordinary Londoners, bread was breakfast, dinner, and supper. It was eaten with ale in the morning, with pottage at midday, with cheese or onions at night. Children gnawed on crusts, laborers carried loaves in cloth bundles, apprentices snatched bites while hurrying through alleys. Life was measured in loaves consumed, and hunger was measured in their absence. Every family felt the weight of this size. They knew the size a loaf should be, and they felt cheated when it was smaller. They watched inspectors in the market with hope, and they muttered curses when punishments fell unevenly. For them, bread was not abstract. It was survival, the daily reckoning between hunger and sustenance. So the image returns, a loaf placed on the scales in Cheapside, the inspector watching, the crowd leaning in, and with it, the question, were the scales of bread truly scales of justice, or were they symbols of a fragile promise, one that might shatter the moment famine pressed too hard? The bread markets of medieval London have long since vanished. The wooden stalls of Cheapside are gone. The inspector scales lie buried in the earth, and the assize of bread has faded from statute books. Yet the memory of those loaves, their weight, their fairness, their role in survival, still whispers through history. For ordinary Londoners, buying bread was an act of trust. A coin exchanged for a loaf was not only a transaction, but a gamble. Would it be heavy enough, nourishing enough, honest enough? The assize of bread tried to make that gamble fair, to assure the poor that their coin would not vanish into air. Trust was fragile. One underweight loaf could shatter it. Crowds remembered the bakers who cheated them, the officials who looked away, the hunger that followed. At the same time, they remembered the bakers who gave full measure, who added a little extra for goodwill, who kept their ovens hot even in years of scarcity. Bread was food, but it was also reputation. The scales of bread became symbols of justice itself. To see a baker punished in the pillory was to see fairness restored, at least in appearance. To see loaves weighed in public was to feel that the hungry had a voice, however small. These acts mattered deeply, for fairness was not abstract in a city where hunger was constant. It was tangible, measured in ounces of bread. In this way, bread shaped the very idea of law. Justice was not only about courts and kings, but about the weight of a loaf in a market stall. The assize taught Londoners that fairness could be measured, enforced, and demanded. It made hunger political, and food a right to be defended. Hunger never disappeared. Famines came and went, harvests failed, and riots flared. Each time, bread was at the center. A loaf too light was not only a cheat. It was a warning sign that the city itself was unstable. Authorities knew this, and so they watched grain prices closely, importing supplies when they could, distributing alms when unrest threatened. The people remembered, too. Families told stories of years when loaves shrank, when queues stretched long, when riots broke out in the markets. Hunger was etched into memory, passed down as caution. Waste nothing, trust little, weigh everything. Over centuries, bread became part of London's very identity. Travelers described the bustling markets filled with loaves, the constant scent of ovens, the strictness of the city's bread laws. To live in London was to live by bread. To eat it daily, to measure wages against it, to judge rulers by its abundance. Even language carried the imprint. The word companion comes from the Latin companus, with bread. To share bread was to share life. In London's markets, companionship and conflict alike were born from loaves, their fairness binding communities together or driving them apart. Today, no inspector weighs your loaf in the market, yet echoes remain. Our modern obsession with fair weights and measures, with consumer protection, with food standards, all trace their lineage to those medieval stalls. The principle that food should be honest, that sellers should not cheat the hungry, was pressed into law centuries ago in the weighing of bread. The people who lived it are forgotten. The bakers who rose at midnight to stoke their ovens, the apprentices who carried baskets down crooked alleys, the inspectors who balanced loaves on scales, the mothers who protested in the streets. They are nameless now. But their lives, their struggles, their hunger shaped a principle that still survives. That fairness could be measured, even in something as ordinary as bread. So picture one last scene, a cold morning in medieval London, a crowd gathered in Cheapside. An inspector lowers a loaf onto a scale. The weight is fair. The crowd exhales. Coins are exchanged, and families go home with bread to break at their tables. For one more day, trust is preserved, hunger is held back, and life continues. And the thought lingers, when history remembers cities, should we honor their towers and kings, or the small fairness of a weighed loaf, the daily justice that allowed ordinary people to eat, survive, and endure? The Byzantine Empire is often remembered for its emperors and jeweled crowns, its glittering mosaics, and its endless wars along the edges of Christendom. Yet behind the gold and the battles lay another empire, quieter but just as powerful, the empire of paper, ink, and bureaucracy. For without clerks, records, and accounts, the Byzantine state could not function. And at the heart of this hidden world was a peculiar obsession, measuring every drop of ink, every sheet of parchment, every candle burned by the hands of scribes. Picture Constantinople in the 10th century. The city streets are alive with merchants, priests, and soldiers. But inside the great administrative buildings near the imperial palace, the sound is not of swords or hymns, but of scratching pens on parchment. Rows of clerks bend over desks, copying decrees, drafting reports, calculating taxes. Their tools are simple: ink made of soot and gum, parchment scraped from animal skins, reed or quill pens sharpened to a fine point. Yet these tools were so precious that every ounce was accounted for. Why such obsession? Because in Byzantium, writing was power. A decree sealed with imperial authority could move armies, alter taxes, decide the fate of provinces. But to issue that decree required parchment, ink, and a trained scribe. The empire knew this, and so it guarded its supplies with the same vigilance it gave to its armies. A single sheet of parchment represented hours of labor. The slaughter of an animal, the careful scraping and stretching of its skin, the smoothing of its surface. Ink, too, was costly, soot gathered, mixed with gum, strained to the right consistency. To waste either was to squander imperial resources. Thus, scribes were watched carefully, their output measured, their tools rationed. Each morning, a clerk might be issued a set amount of ink, enough to copy a certain number of pages. Each week, he might receive a measured stack of parchment. At the end of the day, his work was counted. How many lines had he written? How many pages had he completed? How much ink remained? To fall short invited suspicion, for every drop wasted was a drop stolen from the empire. For the scribes themselves, life was monotonous but demanding. They sat for hours in dim light, straining their eyes, their hands cramping from endless repetition. They copied legal codes, tax registers, letters to provincial governors, theological treatises. Their world was measured not in battles or voyages, but in lines of text, and always behind them, the watchful eye of superiors ensuring that nothing was wasted. Ordinary citizens felt the weight of this bureaucracy daily. Taxes recorded in exact numbers of wheat or coin, property deeds copied and sealed. Even marriages and inheritances, everything passed through the hands of scribes. And behind each document lay the careful rationing of ink and parchment, the quiet measurement that ensured the empire's paperwork flowed. It is tempting to laugh at such obsession, to see it as petty, but it reflected a truth. In Byzantium, survival depended not only on soldiers and farmers, but on administrators. The empire stretched across seas and continents. Its memory was written, not oral. To lose control of ink and parchment was to lose control of history itself. And so, the image lingers, a clerk hunched over his desk, a candle guttering beside him, dipping his pen into a carefully rationed pot of ink. His work is dull, his life uncelebrated, yet without him the empire falters. And one question remains. Did Byzantium endure for 1,000 years because of its armies and faith, or because of the quiet men who measured ink and paper with obsessive care? When we imagine Byzantine politics, we think of emperors in ceremonial robes, generals on campaign, or patriarchs debating theology. Yet much of Byzantine power was wielded not in palaces or cathedrals, but in the cramped rooms where clerks scratched lines onto parchment. A single decree, carefully written, could appoint a governor, order an execution, raise or lower taxes. In Byzantium, paper and ink were instruments of politics, and the bureaucrats who handled them became both guardians and potential manipulators of imperial power. Every decree that left Constantinople carried weight, sealed with wax, stamped with the emperor's insignia, and written in precise script. It was more than words on parchment. It was the empire's voice. Provincial governors treated such documents as law itself. Soldiers marched because of them. Taxes were collected because of them. Disputes ended or began depending on what was written. But authority was fragile. A careless mistake, a smudge, or a missing line could alter meaning. The obsession with measuring ink was partly about preventing waste, but also about preventing error. Superiors checked documents with care, line by line, ensuring that no decree could be questioned. Precision was politics. A perfectly measured document was a shield against dissent. Bureaucrats were not warriors, but they held quiet power. A scribe who delayed a decree could stall a governor's authority. A clerk who lost a tax record might spare a family or ruin them. Even the rationing of ink and paper was a form of control. Without supplies, no one could act, not even powerful ministers. This is why emperors often distrusted their own administrators. Corruption was endemic. Scribes might sell parchment on the black market, forge signatures, or demand bribes to speed up paperwork. Measuring ink and counting parchment was a way to fight this corruption. Every missing sheet or half-empty pot raised suspicion. Yet the very act of rationing also gave bureaucrats leverage. To issue supplies was to control access to imperial authority. The Byzantine Empire was not always rich. Wars, plagues, and territorial losses strained resources. In lean years, even parchment was scarce. Goats and sheep were slaughtered less frequently, reducing hides for parchment. Imported paper from the Arab world was expensive. In such times, scribes were ordered to reuse old documents, scraping ink from parchment to write anew. Margins were filled, spaces compressed, every inch used. Citizens noticed. To receive a legal deed written on recycled parchment was a subtle sign of the empire's weakness. Bureaucracy was a mirror of politics. When supplies shrank, confidence in imperial strength faltered. Byzantine bureaucrats treated documents with ritual care. Completed decrees were copied into registers, stored in archives, cross-referenced against earlier decisions. Clay seals marked authenticity. Every step was measured, checked, and rechecked. The obsession with ink and paper was not just thrift. It was about creating an aura of permanence. Ordinary people experienced this permanence directly. A farmer disputing a tax might be shown a document from decades earlier, pulled from the archives, proving his family's obligation. For him, the empire's memory was not oral or communal, it was written, preserved by scribes who counted each sheet and guarded each drop of ink. Bureaucracy bound him more tightly than armies could. For the scribes themselves, this system was both livelihood and prison. Their days were spent hunched over desks, their eyes straining, their hands cramped. Mistakes could mean punishment, accusations of corruption, even dismissal. Yet their pay was modest, often less than what a skilled craftsman might earn. Many supplemented their income with bribes or side work, selling scraps of parchment or ink on the quiet. The obsession with measuring supplies meant their every action was scrutinized. To use too much ink to return too little parchment was to invite suspicion. They lived under constant surveillance, not unlike soldiers watched by their captains. Their labor was invisible yet essential, a burden carried without glory. What makes this story remarkable is how clearly it reflects the Byzantine Empire itself. Just as the empire measured its borders carefully, defended every fortress, and rationed its wealth, so too did its bureaucracy measure every drop of ink. The state mirrored the scribes, and the scribes mirrored the state. Obsession with detail was not a quirk. It was the essence of survival. So imagine again a dimly lit room in Constantinople. A clerk dips his pen into ink, writing carefully on parchment. Behind him, a superior counts sheets, notes the time, and tallies supplies. Outside, armies march and emperors plot. But inside, the true work of empire continues, quiet, repetitive, precise. And one question lingers. Was Byzantium's 1,000-year survival the result of armies and faith, or the obsessive care of bureaucrats who ensured that nothing, neither parchment nor power, was ever wasted? The Byzantine Empire finally fell in 1453, when Ottoman cannons battered the walls of Constantinople. Its palaces burned, its churches were stripped, its emperors were gone. But in quiet ways, the habits of its bureaucrats lived on. For centuries, they had counted parchment, rationed ink, checked margins, and tallied every word. And that obsession, mocked by some, ignored by many, left a legacy still with us today. Even as the empire shrank, its archives endured. Byzantine scribes had copied, recopied, and preserved records with obsessive care. Legal codes, land deeds, tax registers, documents centuries old, were still pulled from shelves to resolve disputes. After the empire's fall, many of these documents were carried into monasteries or absorbed into Ottoman administration. Some survive in libraries today, their ink still legible, their parchment still intact. When historians study Byzantium, they often rely less on chronicles of emperors than on these bureaucratic relics. A land deed for a farmer, a tax record for a merchant, a scribbled note about supplies. Each fragment offers a window into daily life. The empire's memory, as it turns out, rests less in mosaics and battles than in ink carefully rationed by anonymous clerks. The Byzantine model of bureaucracy influenced its neighbors and successors. The Ottomans, inheriting Constantinople, built their own administrative machine on Byzantine foundations. The idea that every decree must be written, sealed, and archived, that supplies must be rationed and labor tracked, became standard. Western Europe, too, absorbed elements of Byzantine practice. As kingdoms grew more complex, they borrowed the principle that governments must keep permanent written records, and that officials must be held accountable for supplies. Monastic scriptoria mirrored Byzantine diligence, counting inkpots and parchment with equal care. In this way, the bureaucratic habits of Byzantium spread quietly, shaping medieval and early modern governance. To modern eyes, the Byzantine obsession with counting ink and parchment seems tedious. Yet it reveals something deeper. The recognition that civilization is fragile and that order depends on details. One missing sheet, one careless error, one wasted drop. Any of these could ripple outward, weakening the empire's grasp. The scribes knew this. Their vigilance was not mere thrift. It was survival. For ordinary people, the effects were tangible. Their taxes were recorded accurately or sometimes unfairly, but always preserved. Their disputes were judged by documents that outlasted them. Their names, inscribed on parchment, lived longer than their graves. In a strange way, the ink counters gave immortality, though not in the form of fame. If you have ever filled out a form, filed a tax return, or waited for a document to be stamped and approved, you have felt the shadow of Byzantium. Our modern bureaucracies, with their files, signatures, and endless paperwork, descend in part from those scribes who rationed supplies in Constantinople. The principle is the same. Authority requires record, and record requires discipline. The habits survive in language, too. To describe a system as Byzantine is to call it complex, overregulated, obsessed with detail. We forget that this complexity was the reason Byzantium endured for 1,000 years, while other empires crumble faster. The irony is that the men who sustained this legacy remain nameless. They were not emperors or generals, but clerks in dim rooms, dipping pens into measured inkpots. Their days were long, their work repetitive, their lives uncelebrated, yet they shaped history. They proved that power can rest not only on swords and gold, but on discipline, detail, and the quiet labor of writing. So imagine, as we close this story, a clerk in the waning days of Byzantium. Outside, the empire falters. Armies close in, the treasury is thin, the people despair. Yet inside, he sits at his desk, measuring ink, writing lines, preserving order in the face of collapse. His work will not save the empire, but it will outlast it. His parchment will survive where walls fall. His ink will endure where crowns are lost. And the thought lingers. When we measure the greatness of civilizations, do we honor the battles and emperors? Or do we also remember the scribes, the men who counted ink and paper, and in doing so preserved the fragile memory of 1,000 years? When we imagine medieval monasteries, we picture stone cloisters, robed monks chanting Latin hymns, and illuminated manuscripts glowing with gold leaf. Yet alongside the psalters and prayer books sat another kind of manuscript, less beautiful but just as essential, the account book. Written in plain ink on parchment, it recorded not prayers but expenses. Bread bought, ale brewed, candles burned, sandals mended. These ledgers, dull at first glance, reveal the heartbeat of monastic life more clearly than any hymn. Picture a Benedictine monastery in England around the 12th century. The bell has rung for morning prayers, and the monks file into the chapel. Later, they scatter to their tasks. some to the fields, some to the scriptorium, some to the kitchen. And in a small room near the abbot's quarters sits the cellarer, the monk in charge of food and supplies. Before him lies the account book, its pages filled with lines of neat script. His task is not to interpret scripture, but to ensure that the monastery's bread lasts through winter, that its ale does not run out, that the brothers have sandals on their feet and blankets on their beds. Every entry is specific. 2 loaves of rye bread purchased from the town baker, 1 barrel of ale brewed within the monastery, 1 pig slaughtered for the feast of St. Benedict, 6 candles burned in the chapel on Easter night. Each note is practical, factual, precise. To modern eyes, it seems tedious, but to the monks, it was survival. Bread dominated the accounts. A monastery might bake much of its own, but shortages sometimes forced purchases from town. The account books track every sack of flour, every delivery from millers, every extra loaf bought in famine years. Bread was a staple, the food that sustained both monks and the poor at the gates. Its constant appearance in the ledgers is a reminder that holiness rested on full stomachs. Ale was next. Water was often unsafe, and ale, weak but nourishing, was consumed daily. Monks brewed themselves, but the process required grain, fuel, and labor. The account books detail each step. Grain allocated for brewing, firewood gathered, barrels purchased or repaired. Stronger ale was brewed for feast days, weaker for daily use. Every pint was recorded, for waste was a sin and extravagance a danger.